In Deuteronomy 33:2, it says, "And he said, speaking of Moses, the Lord came from Sinai and dawned on them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran, and he came with 10,000s of saints. From his right hand came a fiery law for them." And also in Habakkuk 3:3, it says, "God came from Timan, the Holy One from Mount Paran. Salah. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise." Now, you might be thinking to yourself right now, young Christian, what the heck is the point of this video? What exactly are you explaining? All these passages describe are mountains and places and God coming from them. Like, what's the purpose here? Well, interestingly, Muslims actually use this passage to try to prove that Muhammad is in the Bible. How, you may ask? Well, there are 6 main arguments used. The first argument is that there's an Arabic manuscript that instead of saying his glory covers the heavens, it says the earth was filled with the glory of Mahmud, or something along those lines. I'll put it on the screen probably. So it uses the name Muhammad there. So they'll say, well, look, the name of this person here is Muhammad. Then the other argument is that the location of Paran and Timan is in Arabia. Now, Muslim interpretations might vary here. Some say it's Hijaz, some say it's Mecca. Like it might vary as to where exactly in Arabia they may say, but they will point it into some area that is directly connected to the Prophet Muhammad. So they'll say that Paran and Timan, well, first of all, they'll say Timan is generally referring to the south, and then they'll say Paran is an area that's down there close to some place where Muhammad settled or did something. Next, we have the argument that, well, there's 10,000 saints in Deuteronomy, but Muhammad had 10,000 soldiers with him in Sahih al-Bukhari 4276. So Muhammad fulfills this part of Deuteronomy. The other argument is that he spreads recognition of the true God. And then the other argument number 5, he conquers militarily. There's military conquests from him. And finally, number 6, he comes with a law, in which Muhammad came with, I believe it's called the Sunnah, his laws, right? Muhammad comes with a law. So they'll make those 6 points, make a cumulative case from these 2 passages to say, well, look, this is Muhammad being described right here and being prophesied. Now, what I'm going to do is respond to each of these point by point, except for points 4 and 5, because they're just very generic. So we can just grant them because they're very generic things. Like, this could be fulfilled in anything. So points 1 through 3 and then number 6, I'm going to respond to individually, and then I'm going to give the Christian interpretation of Deuteronomy 33:2 and Habakkuk 3:3 to see what they're actually trying to say. So to reply to argument 1, the manuscript in question is the only one I can find that actually says Mahmud, and it seems to be like just an alternative rendering for where it says his glory covers the heavens, and just connecting it to the next phrase, which says the earth was full of his praise. So even if I grant this reading, which doesn't seem to be the case, the best reading is his glory covers the heavens. Even if I grant it, well, it seems to be that this is just connected to the next phrase, which says, and the earth was full of his praise. Is the earth praising Muhammad? Isn't that shirk? Right? So even if I grant that reading, the term Mahmud there is not a name. It is a title for the praised one. So that's the response there. What about argument 2? Where is Paran and Timan? I think this is a stretch, and I think it's misunderstanding the biblical context here. So I'm going to read the NET footnote, which says, Timan was a city or region in southern Edom, right? And we see that in the Bible. Timan is in southern Edom. This would fit more with describing Sinai, which is closer to there, as the ESV Global Study Bible note on Deuteronomy 32 will point out. Seir is another name for Edom, where Sinai was situated. See Judges 5:4-5, which says, Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the field of Edom, the earth trembled and the heavens poured. The clouds also poured water. The mountains gushed before the Lord. This Sinai before the Lord of Israel. Right? So Sinai is directly connected to Seir, which is another name for Edom. And then it's the note for Mount Paran was in the same area as we see in Deuteronomy 1:1-2, which says, these are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel on this side of the Jordan in the wilderness, in the plain opposite Suf between Paran, Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Dizahab. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. So notice, Paran and Mount Seir are directly connected. Thus, Paran and Timan is associated with Edom near places where Israelites wandered. I think it's kind of alluding to Numbers 10:12, which says, and the children of Israel set out of the wilderness of Sinai on their journeys. Then the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran, talking about the cloud of dust by day that they followed. So examining the biblical context directly applying to the Israelites, which would be more relevant here, it seems to be that is what Mount Paran and Taman is referring to, not Mecca or Hijaz or any kind of area related to the Prophet Muhammad. Now, what about the third argument? Well, Muhammad had 10,000 soldiers, just like God has 10,000 saints. Well, the most commentators point out this is likely referring to angels. And as we'll see in a second, Deuteronomy 33 is directly connected to the Exodus, to that time period, not to a future time period. So it's likely that the saints there, which is actually a different Hebrew word than in verse 3, which mentions the saints, which are Israelites, it's distinguishing them. So it's likely that these are angels. And oftentimes in the New Testament, it mentions, like in Acts 7:53, Galatians 3:19, and Hebrews 2:2, that there were angels involved in that whole thing, especially Acts 7, which says that they received a law by the direction of the angels and have not kept it. So yeah, it's likely that this is referring to angels. What about argument 6? What is this law being spoken about? Well, it's a Mosaic law, and you see that directly in Deuteronomy 33:4, which says Moses commanded a law for us, a heritage of the congregation of Jacob. So this is just the Mosaic law that directly applies to the Israelites. Now, how do we interpret Deuteronomy 33? Well, the passage starts by mentioning Moses. This is a blessing from Moses, and it's very similar to the blessing of Jacob in Genesis 49, where he blesses each of his sons. So Moses is blessing each of the tribes here. And the passage starts by recounting the past. Verses 2-5 are not a future event, but recounting the past. You see that right from there, from the beginning of verse 2, which says the Lord came from Sinai. So that's directly fulfilled right from Moses. And it continues in the past tense for areas in the same region. Seir, Paran, that's all in the same region. So some people might say that Sinai is Moses, Seir is Jesus, and Mount Paran is Muhammad. I don't know how Seir would connect to Jesus. I honestly haven't looked into that. But the most plausible interpretation, the plain reading, is that this is just connecting places from the same area that directly applied to the Israelites. That's the plainest reading of the text. This is not a future prophecy. This is recounting things in the past. So this is not a affirmation of a future prophet coming. In fact, all it says is the Lord came. So it doesn't really mention a prophet. Now, I understand that there can be agency, right? That, for example, someone might say God has come and it's a savior or a prophet or whatever. But in this case, that's not indicated. It's not indicating any prophet coming. It just mentions God. That's all it does. Does not give us indication of a future prophet. It's just recounting past events that God has done, directly applying to the Israelites. We already said what the 10,000 saints in the law is, so I don't really need to mention too much on that. But ultimately, no, this is not a prophecy of Prophet Muhammad. What about Habakkuk 3:3? How do we interpret that? Well, before we interpret that, I want to kind of summarize the book of Habakkuk just very briefly. So the book of Habakkuk contains a story of the prophet Habakkuk foreseeing the fall of the Israelites to Babylon and him crying out to God and questioning him, which leads to a brief back and forth. So Habakkuk is questioning God's ways. Well, you've done this in the past. Why can't you just eradicate these men or whatever it is you will do? And there's a back and forth between him and God, and he's questioning God and asking why he does it the way he did. It's a questioning of God's justice, God's goodness in the face of adversity, suffering, evil. And then it culminates in Habakkuk's prayer and affirmation of his faith in chapter 3. So chapter 3 is a prayer of Habakkuk, and it ultimately ends in an affirmation of faith, directly connected to Babylon, right? To Babylon invading Israel. He's trusting in God. So in light of this, chapter 3 is not a future prediction of a prophet. It is a direct connection to what's going to happen in Babylon, and Habakkuk praying about that. And so in chapter 3, Habakkuk is recounting God's deeds and powers because he knows that God has acted in a certain way in the past miraculously, and he wants him to do it again. But ultimately, God is in control, and he recognizes it and affirms that in his faith. The Holy One here is not a future messenger, but God himself. And that's seen in the constant parallel in the verse. It says, God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. Now, this first two parts, God and the Holy One, it would be inconsistent to say those are two beings, but then to say the next part, his glory and the earth being full of his praise, are then directed to two beings in two sections. No, this is all to God. consistently. So the Holy One is God. In fact, in Leviticus 11:44, the same Hebrew word holy for holy is used of God when it says, "You shall be holy, for I am holy." So that's not an entirely impossible interpretation. It's the plain reading that this is God here, the Holy One. And as we saw already, the location of Paran and Timan is in Edom and is directly connected to the Israelites in the wilderness.